Officer James Porter had been on the job for nearly 15 years and thought he knew how to handle just about any situation he encountered, but today was different. There was something about this traffic stop that felt off the moment he saw the black sedan swerve slightly into the next lane. Without signaling, his instincts flared as he flicked on his siren and pulled up behind the car. The woman behind the wheel was calm. She didn't seem nervous or guilty, which only made him more suspicious. As he approached the vehicle, his eyes scanned her movements as she reached for her registration, but she didn't fumble or act jittery. She simply handed it over without a word of complaints. Something about her poise bothered him. It was as if she was too composed, as if she knew she wouldn't be facing any trouble at all. But that wasn't the case in Porter's mind. Every person he stopped needed to be treated with caution, especially those who didn't seem bothered by authority. He leaned over her car window and flashed his badge. She looked up at him with eyes that were steady, her gaze not breaking from his. But there was a quiet confidence in her stare that made him uncomfortable. It wasn't the fear he usually saw when he stopped someone. It wasn't the anxious body language. He'd grown accustomed to it. Was almost like she was unshakable. Her demeanor was relaxed but polite, and she answered his questions with precision, without a hint of hesitation or nervousness. He asked her where she was headed, and she told him in a calm voice that she was on her way home after work. As a lawyer, she said, and Porter could feel his pulse quicken at the mention of her profession. Lawyers were often troublemakers in his eyes, not because of their work, but because of their ability to navigate the system. They knew the ins and outs. They knew how to twist words and avoid consequences. He kept his gaze on her as she handed over the paperwork. Still nothing seemed to faze her, not even when he asked her to step out of the car and allow him to search it. His words were polite but firm. His mind was made up, and something about the way she remained so collected only fueled his suspicion. What was she hiding? Why didn't she seem worried like everyone else did when they were pulled over? Was she involved in something he didn't know about? Maybe she was more than just a lawyer. Maybe she was someone who had a reason to be too calm, too confident for the situation. Her refusal to let him search her car made him uneasy, but not enough to back down. He could tell she was testing him in her own way, pushing the boundaries. And as much as he hated to admit it, he didn't like being tested. He asked her again, more sternly this time, if she was refusing a lawful search. She nodded her head slowly, but didn't say anything. Her silence only added to the tension in the air. Something about the way she looked at him with those steady eyes made him feel like he was the one being scrutinized instead of the other way around. But Porter wasn't the kind of cop to back down from a challenge, not when he was so sure he was right, and so sure something was off about this woman. The air between them grew heavier as Officer Porter stood tall beside Tanya's car, his hand resting on his holstered gun, though he wasn't ready to draw it yet. But the unease simmered just beneath the surface. Tanya's refusal to allow a search of her vehicle had shifted something in him, a nagging thought that maybe she wasn't who she appeared to be. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this stop than a simple traffic violation. Her calm demeanor only seemed to make the suspicion grow stronger as she sat there looking up at him with those steady, unwavering eyes. It was as though she was daring him to challenge her even further, and that made him more determined to assert his authority. Porter wasn't the type to give up easily, especially when it came to his gut feeling that something wasn't right. He had dealt with situations like this before, where his instinct had led him to uncover something far more troubling than what it appeared to be at first glance. But this felt different. He couldn't quite place it, but his instincts were pushing him toward a deeper level of scrutiny. Tanya's nonchalant attitude only heightened his belief that she was hiding something from him. He couldn't put his finger on what, but the more he thought about it, the more sure he became that she had to be hiding something, whether it was drugs, weapons, or something else entirely. He stepped away from the car and radioed for backup, his voice steady but his mind racing. It was a routine move, but something about it felt heavier today, more urgent. As he waited for the backup to arrive, his mind replayed every moment of the stop, the way Tanya had handed over her registration so smoothly, the way she answered his questions without a hint of hesitation. It all added up to something that didn't sit right. She wasn't acting like most people did when they were pulled over for a minor traffic violation. Usually, there was some level of nervousness, maybe even defensiveness, but Tanya was different. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't trying to talk her way out of the situation. She simply waited and stared at him with those knowing eyes. Porter's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of another officer, a younger cop who approached him with a look of curiosity on his face. "You good, Porter?" The officer asked, but Porter simply nodded and motioned toward Tanya's car. Without a word, the younger cop glanced over at Tanya, who hadn't moved an inch, still sitting upright in the driver's seat with an almost eerie stillness. "What's the deal with her?" The officer asked quietly. "I don't know yet," Porter muttered under his breath. He had hoped the backup would ease his mind, but it only added more weight to his growing suspicion. He had a gut feeling that Tanya wasn't as innocent as she seemed, and that feeling gnawed at him with every passing second. Tanya, meanwhile, hadn't budged. She remained seated, her hands resting calmly in her lap, as if she were simply waiting for him to finish his investigation. Her silence was maddening. It was as though she was playing a game with him, testing his resolve, pushing him to make a move. She wasn't rattled, she wasn't scared, and that, in itself, made Porter feel even more on edge. He found himself questioning his own judgment, wondering if he was missing something right in front of him. His mind whirred with possibilities, but all he could focus on was that stillness in her eyes, that quiet confidence that seemed completely out of place in this moment. The longer Officer Porter stood there, the more unsettled he became. Tanya hadn't flinched once, not even when the second officer arrived, and it was starting to grate on him. There was something about her calmness that seemed off, like she was playing a game he didn't know the rules to. She was unshaken, unaffected. Most people, when confronted by the authority of the law, showed signs of fear, anxiety, or even frustration. But Tanya, she was the picture of composure, and it only deepened Porter's suspicion. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the vehicle," Porter said, his voice carrying the edge of authority. He had given her a fair chance to comply, but now the situation felt more complicated. His gut told him there was something important hidden beneath her calm exterior, something he couldn't yet see but was determined to find. Tanya's steady eyes locked onto his as she slowly opened the car door. "I'm happy to cooperate, officer, but you're overstepping," Tanya said, her tone still polite but firm. She remained in her seat, her hands resting calmly in her lap. The words she spoke weren't an outburst or defiance, but they cut through the tension like a sharp blade. Porter's patience was wearing thin. "It's just a precaution, ma'am. Please exit the vehicle." He had to admit there was something frustratingly composed about her, something that made him feel like he was being tested. His tone shifted, a little more insistent now, but Tanya didn't move. Her eyes didn't waver from his, though there was something almost calculating in her gaze, something that made him pause for a fraction of a second. "I understand your need to do your job, officer," she said, her voice calm, measured, but there was an unmistakable strength in it. "But I also know my rights. I'm under no obligation to step out of the car unless you have a valid reason. You've already asked for a search, and I've told you no. Now you're asking for something more." Porter could feel the shift in the dynamic. Tanya wasn't backing down, and that bothered him even more. She wasn't acting like someone who was scared or intimidated, and that was exactly what he expected people to do when confronted with police authority. Instead, she was questioning him, challenging him with a level of calm confidence that he couldn't quite shake off. His hand instinctively went to his radio, calling for more backup. "I need another unit over here," he said, his voice betraying his growing unease. It wasn't supposed to be this complicated. It wasn't supposed to feel like a standoff, yet that's exactly what was happening. Every second that passed felt like he was losing control of the situation, and he wasn't used to that feeling. Tanya watched him carefully, not moving from her position in the car. Her posture remained perfectly straight, her hands still. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't giving him the reaction he hoped for. Instead, she was calm, almost too calm, and that unnerved Porter. A few moments later, another officer arrived on the scene, a younger cop who glanced between Porter and Tanya. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice low but confused. "Something's off," Porter muttered, keeping his eyes on Tanya. "She's not acting like someone who got pulled over for a simple lane change." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Tanya. "She's not giving you trouble. You sure we need more backup?" Porter didn't answer right away. The more he stared at Tanya, the more certain he became that something wasn't right. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop. The woman in front of him wasn't just another driver caught in the act of a minor violation. There was something about her, something he couldn't explain, that made him feel like he was missing something crucial. His instincts were yelling at him to dig deeper, but at the same time, a voice in the back of his mind kept asking if he was overreacting. He turned his attention back to Tanya. She was still looking at him, her expression unreadable. She didn't look like a criminal. She didn't look like she was hiding anything. But then why didn't she seem more worried? Why wasn't she trying to talk her way out of the situation, like most people did? As the seconds ticked by, the doubt in Porter's mind grew. He was on edge now, second-guessing every decision he'd made so far. Tanya's refusal to cooperate wasn't helping his growing sense of unease. He wasn't just dealing with a minor traffic violation anymore. He was dealing with something more, something that felt wrong in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Something told him that this situation wasn't going to resolve itself easily, and Porter's instincts were screaming at him to stay vigilant. As the minutes ticked by, Officer Porter's anxiety began to mount. Tanya's refusal to cooperate had shifted the dynamic of the stop from a routine traffic violation to something far more complicated. Her calm, controlled demeanor had now become an almost tangible force, throwing Porter off balance. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the back of his mind, telling him that there was more to this situation than he could see. He had spent enough time on the job to know when something wasn't adding up, but this was different. His instincts told him that Tanya wasn't your average driver. She wasn't someone who would be easily intimidated or coerced into submitting to authority, and that troubled him. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," Porter repeated, his voice firmer this time, tinged with frustration. He needed to regain control of the situation, but Tanya remained seated, unflinching. "I've already told you, officer," Tanya said, her tone steady but with a subtle edge now. "I'm not stepping out of the vehicle unless you have a valid reason. I haven't broken any laws, and you have no reason to escalate this further." Porter's patience was wearing thin. He wasn't used to being questioned like this, especially not by someone who seemed so composed and self-assured. His gut told him to push harder, to make her comply, but something deep inside told him that he might be overstepping. Yet the urge to assert his authority was overpowering. "I'm asking you to step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his voice now sharp. "If you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to place you under arrest." Tanya's eyes flickered for a moment, but she remained calm, her hands still resting in her lap. "If you arrest me, you'd better have a damn good reason," she said, her voice cool but with a quiet fire simmering beneath the surface. "And don't forget, I know the law." Porter's frustration flared. How dare she speak to him this way, like she was in control? He had spent years in this line of work, learning how to deal with difficult people, but Tanya was something else entirely. He was used to people being intimidated when they were arrested, but Tanya wasn't afraid. She wasn't worried about the consequences. It was like she knew something he didn't. "All right, that's it," Porter said, his voice firm as he moved to open the door of the vehicle. "You're under arrest." Tanya's eyes narrowed as she looked at him, and for the briefest moment, Porter thought he saw a flash of disbelief pass through her expression. She shook her head, almost pitying him. "For what?" she asked calmly. "What are you arresting me for?" "I'm placing you under arrest for obstruction of justice," Porter said, his hand gripping the door handle as he swung the door open. He was now fully committed, convinced that he had made the right call, even though a part of him wondered if he was taking this too far. Tanya exhaled slowly, clearly disappointed but still maintaining her composure. "You're making a huge mistake, officer," she said softly. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." As Porter reached for her arm to pull her out of the vehicle, he heard a voice behind him. "James, what's going on here?" Porter turned to see his backup, Officer Davis, approaching. Davis had been on the force for a while, and Porter trusted him. The younger officer's eyes flicked between Porter and Tanya, clearly confused by the tension in the air. "I'm arresting her," Porter said, his voice resolute, though a small seed of doubt was starting to take root in his mind. She's obstructing justice. Davis raised an eyebrow. Obstructing? She's not even resisting. He glanced at Tanya, who was still sitting in the car, waiting calmly. What's really going on here? Porter's frustration grew. He had explained his reasoning to Davis already, but now he was starting to feel like his judgment was being questioned. He hadn't imagined that backup would make him feel more on edge. His grip on the situation was slipping, and the second officer's questioning gaze only intensified his sense that he was making a misstep. "Just give me a second," Porter muttered, stepping back from Tanya's car. He needed to regain his composure, figure out if this arrest was truly warranted, or if he had overreacted. He had trusted his instincts earlier, but now his gut was telling him that he might have misjudged this whole situation. Tanya sat quietly, still not resisting, but her eyes were no longer passive. She was watching him with a look of quiet knowing, like she was letting him work through the realization on his own. The air between them thickened, and Porter suddenly found himself unsure. The calm, unassuming woman who had been so composed had become an enigma, and Porter wasn't sure if he was unraveling a case or making a mistake that would haunt him. The tension in the air was palpable as Officer Porter stood there, struggling with his decision. He glanced at his backup, Officer Davis, who was now eyeing him with a mix of concern and confusion. Tanya, still seated in her car, hadn't made a move. She was waiting, watching, as though she were allowing him to figure out his next step. The quietness of the moment hung over him like a heavy fog. Everything in Porter's experience told him that something was wrong here, that Tanya was hiding something. Yet, as he stood there, with the arrest still hanging in the balance, a nagging doubt began to creep into his mind. "James, what exactly are we arresting her for?" Davis asked again, his voice low but insistent. His tone wasn't confrontational, but it was clear he didn't fully understand what was happening. Davis was a solid officer, and his hesitation wasn't lost on Porter. It made the doubt inside him grow louder. Porter hesitated for a moment before responding. "Obstruction of justice. She's refusing to cooperate, and I need to search her vehicle." Davis's brow furrowed. "You're sure about this? I mean, we've only had her here for a few minutes, and she hasn't actually done anything illegal, right?" Porter clenched his jaw. "She's hiding something. I can feel it. She's calm, too calm. It's like she knows what's going to happen next." Davis gave him a skeptical look, his arms crossed over his chest. "James, I get that something feels off, but is that enough to make an arrest? Maybe we're just overthinking this. What if we let her go with a warning?" Porter shook his head, growing more frustrated by the second. "She's not just going to get away with this. If I back down now, it'll look like I'm soft, like she's in control. That's not how this works." Davis remained silent for a moment, then sighed. "All right, I get it. But James, you might want to think this through. Are you really sure she's hiding something? Or are we just assuming she's guilty because she's not acting the way we expect?" Porter felt a sting of doubt at Davis's words, but he quickly pushed it aside. He had already made up his mind. "I'm sure. I'm arresting her." Tanya, still sitting calmly in the driver's seat, spoke up, her voice smooth but sharp. "I told you before, officer, you're making a huge mistake." She paused for a moment, watching him closely. "But you're also making a bigger one by not listening to me." Porter's pulse quickened. Her words weren't just a challenge. They felt like a warning, and they rattled him. How could she sound so confident? Was it possible that she knew something he didn't? Tanya had been so poised from the very start, and now, as she spoke, it was like she was slowly chipping away at his certainty. He had been so sure of her guilt, so convinced that her calmness was proof of something sinister. But now the question lingered in his mind. What if she wasn't hiding anything at all? "Listen," Tanya continued, her voice steady. "I know what you're expecting to find, but I'm not the one who needs to be worried here. You don't know who you're dealing with." She leaned back slightly in her seat, watching him intently, and for a moment, Porter felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. "Who are you?" Porter asked, his voice quieter than he intended, almost as if he was talking to himself. Tanya raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile curling at the corner of her lips. "I'm a state attorney, officer. A lawyer." And if you continue this, you'll be facing some serious consequences for violating my rights. The words hit Porter like a cold wave. State attorney? A lawyer? Everything about the situation suddenly shifted in his mind. Tanya wasn't just another driver he could arrest without question. She was someone who knew the law better than he did. The realization hit him with force. He had been so caught up in his gut feeling and his suspicions that he had completely overlooked the possibility that he was in the wrong. Porter stood frozen for a long moment, the weight of Tanya's words sinking in. She was right. He hadn't bothered to ask the right questions or check her identity properly. He had let his assumptions guide him, and now his certainty had turned to doubt. Davis, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally spoke up. James, I think we need to step back. She's right. If she's who she says she is, we've crossed the line. Tanya's gaze didn't waver. She was still watching him, her expression calm but not without a certain triumph. She knew she had caught him off guard, and Porter had to admit that he was feeling more and more like the one who had been outmaneuvered. Porter took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. His grip on the situation was slipping, and he knew he had to make a decision, one that could affect his career and his reputation. Tanya wasn't just some civilian who could be pushed around. She was someone who could fight back, and if he didn't handle this carefully, the consequences would be far greater than he had anticipated. Officer Porter stood there, his mind racing as the realization of what Tanya had just said sank in. She wasn't just some ordinary citizen. She wasn't a criminal trying to avoid the consequences of her actions. She was a state attorney, a lawyer, someone who knew the law inside and out. His heart pounded in his chest as he thought about the gravity of his situation. What had started as a routine traffic stop had now turned into something far more complicated, and the consequences of his next move could be far-reaching. For a few moments, Porter didn't know what to say. He stood frozen, caught between his pride and his growing unease. Davis, who had been watching the exchange closely, took a step forward. His voice was calm but firm, trying to bring some clarity to the tense situation. James, I think we need to back off, Davis said, his tone more cautious now. If she's a lawyer, we don't want to make this worse. We've already crossed the line, and the longer this drags on, the harder it's going to be to explain ourselves. Porter felt a tightening in his chest. He had prided himself on trusting his instincts, but in this moment, it felt like his gut had led him astray. The self-assurance he had held just moments before was now replaced by doubt, and the doubt made him uneasy. He had taken a small incident, a simple traffic stop, and escalated it to something he wasn't sure he could undo. Tanya didn't seem to be in any hurry to add more pressure. She remained calm and composed in the driver's seat, her hands still resting in her lap, as if the entire situation were a slow-motion scene playing out before her eyes. She watched Porter carefully, the faintest smile still on her lips, though there was no triumph in it. It was more of a quiet understanding, as if she knew the exact moment when his confidence would falter. I wasn't trying to make this difficult, officer, Tanya said, breaking the silence. But you're not just dealing with any random person. I've tried to be patient with you, but you have to understand that I know my rights. And I'm not going to let you violate them because of some assumption that you've made about me. Porter swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. She wasn't just asserting herself, she was right. He had acted based on his assumptions, his gut feelings. He hadn't taken the time to do things properly, and now it was too late to undo it. In his rush to assert control over the situation, he had lost sight of the bigger picture. He hadn't considered the possibility that the woman sitting in front of him wasn't just another civilian. She was someone who had the power to turn the tables. I'm sorry, Porter said quietly, the words feeling heavy on his tongue. He hated the weakness in his voice, but he knew it was the only thing he could say. He had no grounds for an arrest, and his instincts had betrayed him. I should have handled this differently. I made a mistake. Davis, who had been watching the interaction unfold, took a step back and nodded. It happens, man. We all make mistakes. But the important thing is that you own up to it, especially when it could have bigger consequences. I think we need to let her go and clear the air here. Tanya's expression softened slightly, though she remained firm in her stance. Thank you for finally listening, she said, her voice still composed, but with a hint of relief now. I know it's not easy to admit when you've made a mistake, but next time, maybe take a moment to ask the right questions before jumping to conclusions. Porter nodded silently. His mind was still spinning, but he couldn't deny the truth in her words. The moment he had escalated the situation unnecessarily, he had not only jeopardized the outcome of the stop, but he had also put himself in a position where he could face serious consequences if Tanya chose to press charges. The realization was humbling. He stepped back, signaling for Davis to help guide Tanya off the situation. You're free to go, ma'am, Porter said, his voice quieter now, the earlier arrogance replaced by humility. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. Tanya gave a slight nod, her eyes no longer full of defiance, but understanding. She was already gathering her things to leave, unfazed by the outcome. As she opened her door, she met Porter's eyes one last time. Just remember, she said softly, the law isn't about who's right. It's about doing what's right. With that, she closed the door, and with a final glance at both officers, she drove off, leaving Porter standing there, his mind still reeling from the events that had just unfolded. As the car disappeared into the distance, Davis turned to Porter, his expression serious but not unkind. What are you going to do, James? You think you're going to file a report on this? Porter exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. I don't know. I don't even know where to begin. But I'm going to make it right. I have to. The two officers stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation hanging in the air. Porter wasn't sure how he would move forward, but he knew one thing for certain. This incident had changed him. And if he was going to continue being a cop, he was going to have to do better. He had learned a hard lesson today, one he wouldn't forget. The next morning, Officer Porter sat at his kitchen table, staring at the cup of coffee in front of him without really seeing it. The events from the previous day had replayed in his mind over and over, each time with a different perspective. He had woken up with the weight of his mistakes still pressing down on him. It wasn't just about his career or his reputation. It was about the integrity of his actions. He had let his instincts and assumptions cloud his judgment, and now he had to face the consequences of that. Porter had made the decision to file a report, not because it was required by procedure, but because he needed to take responsibility for what had happened. He needed to be honest with himself and, more importantly, with his superiors. The fact that Tanya had been a state attorney didn't change the fact that he had overstepped, and now there was time to make things right. He had barely finished his coffee when his phone rang, the sound pulling him out of his thoughts. He didn't recognize the number, but something about the call seemed important. Hello, he answered cautiously, setting the cup down. Officer Porter? The voice on the other end was calm, but firm. This is Tanya Lewis, the woman you stopped yesterday. I'd like to speak with you about what happened. Porter's stomach tightened, a mixture of nerves and regret flooding him. He had expected something like this, but hearing her voice on the phone made the situation all the more real. I'm listening, Porter said, his voice steady, though he could feel the weight of the conversation bearing down on you. I've been thinking about our interaction yesterday, Tanya continued, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to make this right. I know you acted on what you believe to be a gut feeling, but I also know the law. And what happened yesterday wasn't just an oversight, it was an abuse of power. I need to make sure that doesn't happen again. Porter took a deep breath, his mind racing. He knew that Tanya was right, but hearing her speak so directly about what had occurred left him feeling exposed, like he was standing in front of her all over again, trying to explain himself. But this time, the fear and pride that had once dominated him were gone. He was just a man who had made a mistake and was ready to take accountability for it. You're right, Porter said quietly, his voice softer than usual. I have overstepped, and I understand that my actions could have consequences, not just for me, but for the people I serve. I want to make it right, Tanya. I don't expect you to just let this go, but I'm going to do whatever I can to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again. There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment, Porter wasn't sure if she had hung up. But then Tanya spoke again, her tone more understanding. I appreciate you acknowledging that, she said, but I want to be clear. I'm not looking for an apology. I'm looking for you to understand why what you did was wrong, and I want to see that you take steps to address this. I'm giving you a chance to learn from this officer. That's all." Porter nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I understand, and I'm grateful for the chance. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." The conversation ended shortly after that, but the weight of Tanya's words lingered with Porter. He knew that this wasn't just about avoiding a lawsuit or a reprimand. It was about something deeper. Tanya had given him an opportunity not just to correct his mistake, but to grow as an officer. That meant more than anything. It wasn't about saving face. It was about learning, evolving, and making sure he was doing the job for the right reasons. Porter spent the rest of the morning drafting his report, detailing everything that had transpired the previous day. He was honest, more honest than he'd ever been. There was no embellishment, no excuse-making, just a raw account of his actions, his misjudgments, and the fallout from them. As he finished, he felt a sense of relief, knowing that he was finally taking responsibility. Later that afternoon, he walked into the station to submit the report, his head held high. The weight of the situation still hung over him, but he was no longer carrying it alone. He had taken the first step toward regaining his integrity, and though the road ahead would be difficult, he was ready to face whatever came next. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he was confident that he could handle it. The lessons he had learned from this incident would stay with him, shaping the kind of officer and person he was becoming. As he turned in the report, he glanced up at the surgeon behind the desk. There was no need for words. The surgeon knew what had happened, and Porter knew that this was just the beginning of a long journey to rebuild his reputation. But for the first time, Porter wasn't worried about how others would see him. What mattered now was how he saw himself, and that, he knew, was the most important thing. The following weeks were a quiet turning point for Officer Porter. He didn't expect immediate forgiveness or a smooth path forward. The aftermath of his mistake was still hanging over him like a cloud, but he had made the choice to face it head-on. The report he filed had been submitted, and although he wasn't sure what the next steps would be, he knew he had taken responsibility. He had done what he needed to do to right the wrong. The first sign of change came when his supervisor, Sergeant Clark, called him into his office. Porter was anxious, wondering if there would be consequences for his actions, but he walked into the office with his head held high, ready to face whatever came his way. "James," Sergeant Clark began, looking up from the stack of paperwork in front of him. "I've read your report, and I want to be clear, this is not an easy situation. What happened wasn't ideal, but I respect the fact that you owned up to it." Porter nodded, trying to stay calm despite the weight of the situation. "I've made my mistakes, sir, but I'm trying to learn from them." Clark gave him a thoughtful look. "We all make mistakes, James. It's how we handle them that matters. And you did the right thing by reporting it. I've spoken with the higher-ups, and they're taking your transparency into consideration. We won't sugarcoat this. It'll be in your record. But if you prove that this was a one-time lapse in judgment, you'll move past this. We're all watching, though. It's a chance, not a guarantee." Porter exhaled, feeling a mix of relief and trepidation. He hadn't expected a free pass, but hearing that he had a chance to move forward was encouraging. He wasn't sure how long it would take to regain the trust of his colleagues, but he was willing to do whatever it took. This wasn't just about his career. It was about proving to himself that he could be the officer he wanted to be, one who acted with integrity and fairness. Over the next few weeks, Porter worked harder than ever. He took on extra shifts, volunteered for community outreach programs, and started to approach every situation with a renewed sense of humility. He sought feedback from his fellow officers, learning from their experiences and asking questions where he once might have assumed he knew the answers. His eyes were wide open now to the ways he could improve, and he wasn't going to waste this opportunity to grow. It was during one of the community outreach events that he saw Tanya again. She had been invited to speak as part of a panel on legal rights and community relations. The event was being held at a local school, and when Porter spotted her across the room, he felt a mix of emotions. He wasn't sure how to approach her. After all, the last time they had spoken, it had been under less than ideal circumstances. Tanya, however, spotted him first. She gave him a small, knowing smile, and for a moment, Porter was taken aback. She wasn't holding any animosity. In fact, she seemed genuinely cordial. "You've been keeping a low profile," Tanya said as she approached him, her tone light but with an underlying sincerity. Porter nodded, feeling slightly self-conscious. "I'm trying to make things right, Tanya. I've been working hard to prove I'm not that guy. I don't want to let my mistakes define me." Tanya's gaze softened. "I respect that, Officer Porter. I think you've got the right attitude now. It's easy to get caught up in the system, but it takes someone with real integrity to admit when they've been wrong. Not everyone does that." Porter felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Tanya wasn't just forgiving him for his mistake. She was offering him validation. Her words didn't just reflect a chance for him to move forward, but a recognition of the growth he had made. "I appreciate you saying that," Porter replied, his voice sincere. "I'll keep working at it. I want to be better for everyone. I'm not the officer I was before this." Tanya nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I'm glad to hear that. Just remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about doing the right thing when it matters. And you're on the right path." Their conversation was brief, but it was enough. As Tanya returned to the panel, Porter stood there, reflecting on everything that had happened. He realized that he wasn't just moving past the mistake. He was becoming someone different because of it. Someone more aware of the impact his actions had, someone who wasn't afraid to grow, to learn, and to change. The road to redemption wasn't easy, and it wasn't always clear. But as Porter watched Tanya speak to the group, he knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and that, he believed, was enough for now.